Siberia isn't exactly what most people would consider a paradise. The mountainous areas of northern Asia are virtually uninhabitable, more akin to Antarctica than Novosibirsk, which explains the extremely low population density of the indigenous people of the region. So, when Russia had its manifest destiny kick in the 16th century, it didn't take long to completely dominate most of the Siberian tribes. But trouble came when they finally reached the Pacific coast, a region known as the Far East that borders the ancient Asian nations of Japan, Korea, China, and Mongolia. The conquerors of this region, known as the Cossacks, were known worldwide for their unrelenting effectiveness as well as their brutality. Think of them like the conquistadors in Spanish America. They were more of a social class than an ethnic group, since the Cossacks were of various Eastern Slavic origin, especially Ukrainian, among the Don, Kuban, and North Caucasus regions, although technically people of any ethnicity could become a Cossack if they proved their fighting prowess and loyalty to the motherland. Up until this point, the only coastlines the Russian Empire had obtained were around the inland seas of Eastern Europe, as well as the Arctic Ocean, the latter of which obviously isn't exactly a game-changing asset. But in the Far East, half a world away from Kiev and Moscow lie 2,800 miles or 4,500 kilometers of nearly uninhabited Pacific coastline, only a stone's throw away from some of the most populated and profitable markets in all of Asia, a truly golden opportunity. The only problem was getting there. The eastern Siberian mountains were nearly impossible for the Cossacks to cross for many decades until they managed to traverse many of the rivers and waterways that connected to the Pacific. So, by the 1600s, they had finally reached the Sea of Okhotsk, which, by the way, is named after the river Okhatka, which leads to the small town of Okhotsk, the first ever Russian settlement established on the Pacific coast. The history of this region has many parallels with the western half of the U.S., as much like the Wild West, the Wild East was fraught with conflict, violence, opportunities, and illustrious natives, and this new frontier was characterized by extremely high levels of diversity, fascinating migration patterns, and bizarre history. Meanwhile, to the south, in the 17th century, the Cossacks attempted to push down the Amur River into the boundaries of the Qing dynasty, with limited success, but were ultimately repelled by Manchu troops with the help of neighboring Tungusic tribes. Over time, the Qing's power gradually waned, especially in the aforementioned borderlands, and coupled with the rise of Japan as a military and industrial giant of Northeast Asia, paved the way for change and conflict. Even though the region north of the Amur River, known as Transcathay in Russian, was a de facto Chinese vassal for hundreds of years, it was devoid of any significant Han Chinese populations, as the ruling Qing dynasty forbid the Han from settling in Manchurian territory up to the 18th century. So, despite forming around 7% of Qing's entire land area at the time, or around 350,000 square kilometers, the territory past the Amur was home to only a few tens of thousands Tungusic and Siberian natives. So when the Russians came knocking once more in the 1850s, they were able to conquer massive swaths of territory and push around the massive empire with relatively few troops. This region was invaluable to the Russian Empire, having one of the very few coastal locations that had open access to the ocean and didn't freeze over in the winter, and it desperately needed to be populated, and fast. Ukrainians seemed like an ideal choice for enticing settlers. Ukraine had the highest population density of any region of the Russian Empire at the time, which led to land shortages, overpopulation, and socio-political unrest. And as a bonus, the newly settled Ukrainians would act as a buffer to stave off raids from hostile natives and belligerent neighboring nations. The newly acquired territories in the southeast also had a remarkably similar climate and environment to Ukraine in the Kuban region, allowing the smooth integration of tens of thousands of settlers, mainly from Chernihiv, Kiev, Poltava, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Luhansk. These were overwhelmingly impoverished and illiterate peasants, which led to a rapid degree of language switching and assimilation with the Russian minority, who made up no more than 10% of migrants before 1900. Belarusians were a much smaller minority, about 5% of the original settlers, and assimilated with the Russians faster than the Ukrainians did. This region was only one of many on the borderlands of the empire that received large numbers of Ukrainians and became known as Zelenyi Klin, or Green Ukraine. But because of the vast distance from Europe and isolation, they struggled to maintain their distinct identity and connections to their homeland. For a time in the late 1800s, the entire Pacific Far East region was administered as Primorsky or Primorskaya, which simply translates to coast or ocean side. The original Primorsky Oblast, established in the 1850s, stretched all the way from Chukotka and Kamchatka to Amur and Vladivostok, an absolutely massive region, larger than almost any other country in Asia at the time. But alarmingly for Russian authorities, the combined population of the entire region, including the indigenous people, was less than 500,000 by the start of the 20th century. Quite an improvement from the 40,000 that lived there 4 decades prior, but still leaving its border practically defenseless against the far more densely populated regions of Japan and Chinese Manchuria, which had 43 and 15 million people respectively at that time. Hence, the Russian government began enthusiastically encouraging settlement from pretty much any source they could, with the main priority at the time to create an established population on the new frontier so that another nation doesn't do to them what they just did to dozens of different groups during their march to the Pacific. The first and last national census by the Russian Empire in 1897 recorded an extremely diverse population in the region, with Russian speakers making up a little less than half the population, with the next largest being Ukrainian speakers at roughly 15%. A majority of ethnic Ukrainians spoke Russian as their mother tongue at that time. The Han Chinese were around 10%, 7% Korean, and a little less than 1% Japanese, with indigenous Siberian and Northeast Asian peoples making up most of the remaining 19%. The Russians aimed for eventually annexing the entirety of the Manchuria region, and they almost did it too, gaining a strong foothold in the region around the city of Harbin in Heilongjiang and other towns along the Eastern Chinese Railway. Following the Boxer Rebellion, where foreigners and Chinese Christians were being killed en masse, Russia used this as justification to invade Chinese Manchuria down to the newly acquired Port Arthur in Liaoning, completely cutting off China's border with Korea. But it turns out their eyes were a bit too big for their stomach. The Japanese used this as an excuse to invade China as well, seizing Port Arthur and southern Sakhalin, and they ended up inheriting Russia's territories in northeast China after the disastrous Russo-Japanese War, cementing Japan as East Asia's foremost power. This event, coupled with the collective trauma experienced during World War I and extreme societal problems in Russia, were some of the major catalysts for the collapse in the Civil War and the Communist Revolution that would set the stage for the unimaginable horrors to come for the people of Russia, and not even the Far East could escape the chaos. Some Ukrainian leaders in the Far East met to discuss and make plans for Green Ukraine to declare its independence and mobilize their own armed forces. The elected leader of this proto-state, Yuri Gleshko, a native of Chernihiv and World War I veteran, had spent time in Harbin in the East Chinese Railway, rallying support for the cause among the local community, Ukrainian diaspora, and even established relations with the fledgling Ukrainian People's Republic thousands of miles away in Europe. The 5 largest nationalities in the region's population of around 800,000 were Russians, Ukrainians, Koreans, Chinese, and Belarusians, with native Siberians making up around 5% of the population by that time. It was unclear just what exactly the borders of this new state were going to be. At the very least, it would have included Amur, Khabarovsk, Primorsky, possibly stretching north to Chukotka and Kamchatka, and some called for including Harbin and northeast Manchuria, but this area was being rapidly gobbled up by the Japanese. Not to mention the Japanese military had also temporarily occupied even more areas of the Far East, such as Vladivostok. The Green Ukraine project was never fully implemented, and their aspirations were crushed when pro-Bolshevik forces arrested the leaders of the movement and established the Far Eastern Republic, a Soviet puppet state that was eventually reabsorbed into Russia after they had defeated the last of their opponents in the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of anti-communists from the Russian Empire, known as the Whites as opposed to the Reds, would flee to Chinese Manchuria, which included tens of thousands of Ashkenazi Jews and smaller numbers of Tatars, Germans, and others. Of the Slavic migrants to the region, estimates vary, but it is known that Ukrainians were a significant proportion of migrants from the start, with a ratio of anywhere from 1:1 to 1:2 compared to the ethnic Russian population. For the most part, Slavs in the Japanese Manchukuo endured harassment and abuse on a daily basis, not only from the Imperial Japanese and Soviet governments, but also from the local Chinese population that was resentful for the suffering and humiliation by the Russian Empire inflicted on them mere decades before. A large percentage of this community ended up being massacred or experimented on by Unit 731, after which almost the entire population of Slavic Manchurians fled China, either going back to the USSR or escaping to the Western world through the Pacific. The community in the Russian Far East continued to grow well after the communists took power. The combination of emigration and Russification was a major factor that ensured the region would remain firmly in the Russian sphere, but the Soviets did allow a certain degree of autonomy for local Ukrainians, and migration to the region continued until 1939. In the Soviet census of 1926, ethnic Ukrainians still outnumbered Russians in the rural areas of Primorsky Krai at a ratio of about 55 to 45. The rural population of Khabarovsk Krai had the reverse ratio at 55 Russians for every 45 Ukrainians, and in Amur it was about 70-30. The Ukrainians of the more remote northern regions of the Russian Far East, such as Kamchatka, Magadan, and Chukotka, have a markedly different history, and the majority did not come to the area voluntarily, but were either deported there as punishment for anti-Soviet actions, or to use as hard labor in some of the more lucrative state-run operations to extract natural resources from the Arctic. After World War II, some Ukrainians were resettled in the southern Kuril Islands near Japan to validate Soviet territorial claims, and their Russified descendants are the majority of the population there to this day. Certain post-World War II Soviet authorities worked to actively suppress the Ukrainian identity and language throughout Russia, but especially in the Far East, as a potential secession of this region was a nightmare scenario. Negative sentiments regarding the Ukrainian minority have been deeply ingrained among much of the Russian population, which has clearly been amplified to new heights in recent decades. According to locals, anti-Ukrainian bigotry in the Far East doesn't seem to be quite as extreme as in other parts of Russia, and this is probably one of the reasons that the Kremlin has once again began importing ethnic Ukrainians to the Far East after their recent invasion. Nevertheless, the underlying atmosphere of hostility has exacerbated an already terrible situation in the region. Historically, the Ukrainians didn't even receive the worst treatment of ethnic groups in the Far East, as the once thriving Chinese and Korean communities, previously numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were almost completely destroyed through deportation to parts unknown, or were otherwise slaughtered during the region's troubled history. Stalin treated the USSR like his own personal kingdom, and his myriad of crimes against humanity have left a permanent mark on the demographics and culture of the Far East, Siberia, and almost all of Russia today. Although they continued to grow in absolute numbers after the war, the proportion of those who identified as Ukrainian in the Far East never returned to its previous heights as the Russification process accelerated throughout the latter half of the 20th century, and especially after the collapse of the seemingly unstoppable Soviet superpower. Directly before the collapse of the USSR, the 1989 census recorded over 500,000 Ukrainians in the Russian Far East, or almost 10% of the population. Some sources even claim that in the modern day, a majority of Slavs in the Far East are of partial or predominant Ukrainian descent. And far from being Ukrainian propaganda, there's actually some truth to this. Many of the original settlers in the area were Don and Kuban Cossacks, and according to Soviet sources, over 60% of all settlers in the region came from Ukraine. This could partially explain why the modern culture and dialect of the Far East is distinct from that in Siberia and European Russia, and this has no doubt played a role in the separatist movement supported by a small but growing minority in the region. Another cultural quirk of the Far East is that it is currently the least religious region of Russia. In Sakhalin Oblast, for instance, less than a quarter of the population identifies as Christian. And this is no surprise considering the history of the region. To be fair, it seems like the situation for just about everyone in the Russian Far East is absolutely dire. Fueled by a drug and alcohol epidemic even worse than that in Siberia, life expectancy for males in the region has dropped to around 60, which is on par with most African countries. Violent crime and homicide rates are the highest out of any region of Russia, and the population has dropped from over 7 million at its height in 1990 to less than 5 million as of 2024. And in the 2020 census, the number of ethnic Ukrainians dropped to a meager 37,000, a pitiful showing compared to the 544,000 in 1989. So how is this even possible? The official data released by the Russian Census in recent years have been notoriously unreliable, with the 2020 census being so obviously manipulated it's almost laughable. Although many Ukrainians have begun to flee Russia after 2014, and especially 2022, many others have stayed behind and maintained a low profile, as it is not without precedent for the majority population to quickly assimilate into the dominant minority. Germans, Scandinavians, and other Northwest Europeans generally assimilated into the Anglo population of the American frontier within 1 or 2 generations, for instance, despite making up a vast majority in some of these settlements. This would explain why over 90% of the population identifies as ethnic Russian today, despite a large proportion being full-blooded Ukrainians. So what percentage of these Russians in the Far East are actually Ukrainians? Well, I couldn't find any surveys on the matter, but by pouring through mountains of data, I was able to find a 2007 study on the haplogroup distribution of 152 Russian-speaking males from Vladivostok, and it is fairly typical of Eastern Slavic populations and has similarities with the modern populations of Eastern Ukraine and those from South-Central Russia. And considering Vladivostok historically had one of the smaller proportions of Ukrainians in the Far East, this is a strong indicator that other areas would have even more divergent genetics than the average Russian. Ukrainian sources, such as the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, estimated that at least 40% of the population of the Far East is fully or mostly Ukrainian, and Russian sources don't even want to touch the subject, but without further studies in the modern age, it's impossible to know for sure. So while the war between these two nations rages on, it's important to remember the multitude of historical connections and contributions of Ukrainians throughout all of Russia that makes this invasion and widespread animosity even more tragic. Please let me know your thoughts on the fate of the Far Eastern Ukrainians and other minorities in the region that had the misfortune of being erased from history. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason. I'll see you next time.